This will be for my Spotify video. Here is my script with the in-text citations of the lines. Hello everybody, today I will be discussing the Spotify podcast episode, We the People, the Life and Legacy of Frederick Douglass, and making connections to our assigned reading, Frederick Douglass's narrative. I'll also identify 2 major points from the podcast and pose an open-ended discussion question at the end, like required. One major point the podcast emphasizes is the idea of self-emancipation through literacy. The speakers explain how Douglass recognized early on that learning to read and write was a pathway to freedom. This directly parallels Douglass's own explanation in the narrative, where he recalls Mr. Ault's warning: if you give a word I can't say an inch, he will take another word I can't say. In the end, first revealed to him that literacy was the key to liberation. Douglass, page 29. The podcast reinforces this moment as a turning point in his life, showing how literacy became both a political tool and a means of self-definition. A second major point made in the podcast is Douglass' own evolution as a public thinker and statesman. The episode notes that after escaping to the North, Douglass did not simply join the abolitionist movement, he reshaped it. This parallels the end of the narrative, where Douglass describes standing before a predominantly white anti-slavery audience and finding himself unexpectedly moved. He reflects on speaking publicly for the cause of my brethren, Douglass, page 93, which anticipates the later national influence the podcast does describe. Both the book and the episode frame Douglass's voice as central to transforming American political discourse. Now I'll draw the 3 clear parallels between the podcast and the assigned reading. First parallel is both emphasize Douglass's early realization that enslavers maintained power by controlling knowledge. In the narrative, Douglass recounts that literacy would allow him to run away, page 31. The podcast echoes this by discussing Douglass's determination to educate himself, set him apart from other people, and made his later activism possible. Second parallel, both highlight the psychological brutality of slavery. In the narrative, Douglass describes how slavery converted man into brute, page 39. The podcast draws this idea when discussing Douglass's later critiques of the institution, how he insisted slavery dehumanized both enslaved people and slaveholders. This parallel shows that Douglass's analysis of slavery was consistent throughout his life. Third parallel is both the text and podcast underline, not undermine, the importance of public speech as a tool for abolition. The narrative ends with Douglass speaking before an audience, which serves as a kind of proof of his intellectual authority. This podcast expands on this by showing how Douglass continued using oratory technique for decades, eventually becoming one of the most influential voices of the 19th century. His public advocacy becomes a bridge between his personal story and national change. As for the significance of the podcast's main points, the focus on literacy matters because it illustrates that freedom is not only physical but intellectual. Douglass's embrace of learning becomes a blueprint for resisting systems of oppression. Meanwhile, the emphasis on his public oratory skills matters because it demonstrates how one individual can reshape political narratives, especially narratives about citizenship and the Constitution and race. To conclude, my question is, how does Douglass's transformation from his life as a slave to public intellectual challenge the way we typically think about who gets to shape national identity and public memory?